Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at the case of Robert Lee Yates Jr., the Spokane serial killer.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we've got some excerpts from a Wikipedia article, and we're going to kind of try and make sense of this guy, like, how he was able to live a seemingly normal life while committing these really horrific acts.
Right.
Yates murdered at least 16 people, and what's really disturbing is that a lot of his victims were sex workers who were battling addiction.
Yeah, it's a case that really makes you wonder, like how do people like that function normally in society?
Yeah, it's really mind-boggling. So let's start with Yates's early life. He was born in 1952 in Oak Harbor, Washington. Grew up in a seemingly typical middle-class family, even went to a Seventh-day Adventist church, but there's this one detail we can't really ignore. His own grandmother actually murdered his grandfather.
Wow.
Yeah, with an axe back in 1945. I mean, how does something like that not affect you?
I mean, that's the question, right? You see
Right.
something like that happen within your family at such a young age, it's got to have some kind of psychological impact.
Totally. And then after high school, Yates actually worked as a corrections officer at the Washington State Penitentiary.
Oh, wow.
Talk about being surrounded by crime.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You would think that working in a place like that would kind of deter someone from crime, but maybe it had the opposite effect on it.
It's crazy. And then in 1977, he joins the army, becomes a skilled helicopter pilot.
Really?
Yeah, Germany, Somalia, Haiti, stationed all over the world.
That's crazy. And he was living this double life the whole time.
I know, it's incredible. And he even earned multiple commendations like the Master Aviator badge.
Huh. It's just so strange to think that he had this dark side hidden. Like how does that even happen?
And he kept this double life going for years. He got married in 1976 and had 5 kids with his second wife, Linda, like a seemingly normal family man.
Yeah, it really goes to show that you never really know someone.
So true, but we can't shy away from the reality of his crimes either. Investigators believe that he actually started killing in 1975. He shot a young couple who were on a picnic near Walla Walla. It's terrifying to think that his murderous tendencies might have started even before his military career.
Yeah, it really makes you think like what was going on in his mind back then.
Absolutely. And this pattern really becomes clear with his crimes in Spokane. He preyed on vulnerable women. A lot of them were sex workers who were struggling with addiction.
Yeah.
He would often find them on East Sprague Avenue.
Right.
It's just heartbreaking. It really speaks to this disturbing need for power and control over these women.
Yeah, it's a classic pattern with serial killers. Unfortunately, they often target people who are marginalized, who they think won't be missed.
Yeah. That's a chilling thought, but it's true. And to really grasp the impact of his crimes, we have to talk about the victims themselves. I mean, each life that he took represents a whole story cut short, a family that was devastated. For example, there's Jennifer Joseph. She was only 16 years old, a runaway who got caught up in drugs and sex work. Imagine the pain that her family must have felt.
Yeah, it's a reminder of how vulnerable young people can be, especially when they're facing challenges like addiction and homelessness.
Right. And then there's Sean McClenahan and Lori Wasson. They were found together, each with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Their heads were wrapped in plastic bags.
Oh my gosh.
I know. And they both had these really interesting lives. Sean loved Winnie the Pooh and going to auctions, but addiction just took over. Lori was actually a dedicated mom who bred Rottweilers, but a relapse with heroin led her back to the streets. It just breaks your heart to think about the lives that they could have lived.
Yeah, their stories really humanized the victims.
Yeah.
There were more than just statistics. They were real people with families and people who loved them.
Exactly. And another really sad story is Michelin Durning. She came from a really privileged background. Her dad was a Marine Corps colonel. She even went to college, but then drugs derailed everything. Just another life full of potential that was tragically cut short.
Right. It just goes to show that addiction can affect anyone.
Absolutely. And this is a good place to transition to the final victim that we'll highlight in this part, Christine Smith. Her story is particularly chilling because she's the only known survivor of Yates's attacks. Can you imagine the courage it took for her to come forward?
Yeah, I can't even imagine going through something like that and then having to relive it all by talking to the police.
Right. In August of 1998, she filed a police report, and she described how she was hit in the head during a sex act. She even described Yates and his van. She mentioned that he claimed to be a National Guard pilot with 5 kids.
Wow. So she remembered a lot of details.
I know, but get this. The police actually found bullet fragments in her hair, and she didn't even realize that she had been shot.
That's crazy.
I know it's a miracle she's alive, and her detailed account, along with the physical evidence, would eventually play a key role in bringing Yates to justice. But we'll delve deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive. For now, let's pause here and let all of this information sink in.
Yeah, this is heavy stuff. It's amazing to think that for all those years, Yates was able to just keep this dark side of himself hidden from everybody.
Yeah, but eventually all those years of secrets started to unravel, right?
Exactly. Back in 1998, the Spokane police asked him to give a DNA sample as part of their investigation. You would think an innocent man wouldn't even hesitate.
Yeah, totally. But Yates actually refused. He claimed that it was too extreme for a family man.
Oh, wow.
Can you believe that? Like, he really thought he could just talk his way out of it.
Yeah, that's a huge red flag right there. I
Yeah.
mean, refusing a DNA test when you're already a suspect, it just makes you look even more guilty.
It's incredible how people can be so deceptive, but luckily, the police didn't just let it go 2 years later in 2000. They finally arrested Yates for the murder of Jennifer Joseph.
Yeah, that was a major turning point in the case because it gave the police the opportunity to really start digging into his life and uncover the full extent of his crimes.
So what did they find? What kind of evidence finally linked him to all these murders?
Well, they searched a white Corvette that he used to own, and inside they found blood that matched Jennifer Joseph's DNA.
Wow.
But it didn't stop there. They also found his DNA on 12 other victims.
That's incredible. So with all this evidence stacked against him, what happened next? Did he go to trial?
While facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Yates decided to take a plea deal.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he confessed to the murders in Spokane County and was sentenced to 408 years in prison.
408 years. Wow. That's essentially a life sentence anyway.
Pretty much, yeah. It was a way for him to avoid the death penalty while ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars.
It must have been a huge relief for the families of the victims to finally get some justice.
Absolutely. A confession like that can bring a sense of closure, even if it doesn't bring back their loved ones.
Hmm.
But Yates' story wasn't over yet. He was later charged and convicted in Pierce County for 2 more murders, Melinda Mercer and Connie Ellis.
So even after that plea deal, he still faced justice for those additional crimes.
That's right. And this time there was no escaping the death penalty. In 2002, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection.
So after all those years, all those lives lost, justice was finally served. But wait, didn't something happen with his sentence later on? Didn't Washington abolish the death penalty?
You're right, in 2018, Washington state abolished the death penalty. And as a result, Yates' sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So now he's spending the rest of his days at the Washington State Penitentiary, which brings up a lot of questions like what could have driven this seemingly normal man to commit such horrific acts? I mean, we've talked about his family history, his time in the military, but is there more to it?
That's the question. Isn't it? Understanding the psychology of a serial killer is a complex and often frustrating task. There's rarely a simple answer.
So in Yates's case, what are some of the things that might have contributed to this descent into darkness?
Well, we've already touched on the potential impact of his grandmother's crime, witnessing such a brutal act at such a young age. It could have had a profound effect on his development, perhaps desensitizing him to violence.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's his military service. While it's not a direct cause, exposure to trauma and violence, particularly in conflict zones, could have played a role in shaping his psyche.
Right. Think about it in the military. Taking a life can be seen as an act of duty or even heroism in some cases. It's possible that this experience, combined with any pre-existing vulnerabilities,
Right.
created a dangerous disconnect within him, a separation between the man he presented to the world and the darkness that was brewing inside.
And we can't forget about the role of substance abuse. Both Yates and many of his victims struggled with addiction.
Absolutely. Substance abuse is a factor in a lot of violent crimes. It can lower inhibitions, impair judgment, and fuel aggressive impulses. In Yates's case, it's possible that drug use amplified his pre-existing tendencies, making him more likely to act on his dark urges. And let's not forget that his victims, many of whom were involved in sex work due to addiction, were already incredibly vulnerable.
It's just a cycle of pain and suffering that's so hard to comprehend. But even with all these contributing factors, it's important to remember that none of them excuse Yates's actions. He made the choice to take innocent lives.
Exactly. While it's important to understand the complexities of these cases, we can't lose sight of the fact that Yates was responsible for his own choices. He chose to act on his impulses, and he chose to inflict unimaginable pain on others.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from Yates's early life to his chilling crimes and his eventual capture, but there's still so much to unpack. We'll be back in a moment to delve a bit deeper into the psychological aspects of this case and explore some of the broader questions it raises.
Okay, we're back. And, I was still thinking about everything we talked about in the last part. This Robert Lee Yates Jr. case is just one of those stories that sticks with you.
It really does. I mean,
Yeah.
the contrast between his seemingly normal life and the horrific things he did, it's hard to reconcile.
It really is. So before we wrap things up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how complex the psychology of serial killers is, knowing what we know now about Yates, his background, his actions. What are some of the takeaways from this case?
Well, one of the biggest things is that there isn't one specific profile that fits all serial killers. Yates didn't fit a lot of the stereotypes. He had a family and a career. He seemed normal to people who knew him.
Right, like a regular guy.
Exactly. And it's scary to think about because it means that anyone could be hiding this kind of darkness you never really know. That's a terrifying thought. It makes you wonder if you can ever truly know someone.
It really does. And it also shows how important it is to pay attention to those little red flags, even if they seem small at the time.
Like what kind of red flags?
Like his refusal to give a DNA sample that should have been a huge warning sign.
Yeah, it definitely should have. And we also can't forget about the bigger issues that make certain groups more vulnerable, especially marginalized communities. So many of Yates's victims were sex workers who were struggling with addiction. They were already facing so many challenges, and that made them targets.
You're absolutely right. We can't ignore the social and economic factors that create these situations where predators can take advantage of people.
It's a complex problem for sure, but we have to start addressing it somewhere.
Okay, I want to change gears a little bit and talk about forensic science. The DNA evidence was really crucial. In this case, it linked Yates to all those murders and helped bring him to justice. DNA analysis has completely changed criminal investigations.
Mm.
I mean, it's helped solve so many crimes
Mm.
and even exonerated innocent people who were wrongly convicted. It's amazing how far the technology has come.
It's powerful stuff, and in Yates's case, the DNA evidence was undeniable. There was no question about his guilt. So I guess the big question that I keep coming back to, and I'm sure our listeners are wondering this too, is how can we as a society get better at identifying people like Yates before they hurt anyone, especially when they blend in so well?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And there's not an easy answer. I think it starts with being more aware. We need to educate ourselves about the signs of predatory behavior, the subtle things that might hint at someone having these dark urges.
Right, like noticing when things seem a little off.
Exactly. And we need to create a culture where people feel safe reporting those concerns without feeling judged or like they'll be retaliated against.
So it's about building a sense of responsibility in our communities, watching out for each other, and trusting our gut feelings.
Absolutely. We also need to address the underlying problems that create vulnerability, like poverty, addiction, and the lack of mental health services. These things create environments where predators can easily exploit people.
You've given us a lot to think about for sure. This case really highlights how dark things can be out there, even in the most unexpected places. But it also shows how important it is to be aware and compassionate and to work together to build a safer society.
I agree. We all have a role to play in preventing these kinds of tragedies from happening.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Robert Lee Yates Jr. case. We hope that this discussion has helped you understand this case a little better and maybe inspired you to think critically about the world around us.
Knowledge is power. The more we learn about why people do these terrible things, the better prepared we are to confront those problems and work towards a future where these things happen less often.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.